Well, as we mentioned earlier, the Kiev Jewish Forum has added meaning this year, coming alongside a historic anniversary. 30 years ago, Israel was among the very first nations to recognize newly independent Ukraine after the breakup of the Soviet Union. On December 26, 1991, the two countries established official diplomatic ties. And since then, as you've heard, the relationship has blossomed from economics to culture, tourism, science, and to medicine. And to begin our closer look at those ties, we have the privilege of hearing from Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dmytro Kuleba. Foreign Minister Kuleba, who is also a minister of Ukraine's National Defense and Security Council, will share some insights on the contemporary relationship between Israel and Ukraine. And Foreign Minister Kuleba, thanks so much for being with us. And I'll go ahead, first of all, and turn it over to you.
Thank you for having me. I listened with pleasure and interest to your previous discussion. Allow me to deliver some remarks dedicated to the bilateral relations between Ukraine and Israel. And as you absolutely rightly stated, this is a very special year for us, 30 years since establishment of diplomatic relations. And then I will be happy to answer your questions. So, 30 years, it's a relatively short historical period for our states, but ties between our peoples are much deeper than that. Ukrainians and Jews lived side by side for centuries, and our common history has both bright and dark pages. Both of our nations experienced terrible national catastrophes in the 20th century, such as the Holocaust and the Holodomor. One of the most dreadful tragedies is the Babinyar Massacre. It doesn't matter how much we talk about Babinyar and how much truth we are revealing about what happened on those dark days, there will never be enough. This is the feeling that I had during this year's ceremony, the commemorative ceremony at Babinyar. And every time you walk into that place, you feel the duty to work more and more on bringing back truth, concealed for decades during Soviet times. It's only the independent Ukraine that actually started talking openly and opening about this massacre and opening those tragic pages. I'm afraid if the Soviet Union had been still alive, we would not have known the truth of Babinyar, and it would have not been widely recognized. Babinyar was a horrendous crime of the Nazi regime committed on our soil 80 years ago. A couple of months ago, Ukraine, together with delegations from all over the world, including the president of the State of Israel, Isaac Herzog, other world leaders, representatives of international organizations, Holocaust witnesses, Ukrainians who saved Jews during the Nazi occupation, as well as the rightest among the nations from other countries, commemorated the innocent victims of Holocaust. We will keep the memory of the Babinyar forever in order to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. Ukraine strongly condemns all forms of intolerance and anti-Semitism, and the Ukrainian authorities at all levels make every effort to fight any of their manifestations. And we will continue to do so. We are absolutely confident that there is no place for anti-Semitism in Ukraine. Coming in a few days is the 73rd anniversary of the UN General Assembly Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted on December 9, 1948. Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish Polish lawyer, was the one who gave this heinous crime a name and persuaded the General Assembly of the United Nations to outlaw it. And Mr. Lemkin has his own connection with Ukraine, as he spent some time in the beautiful city of Lviv. There are not only dark, but also bright pages in our common history that we can be proud of and that make ties between our states and nations so special. Needless to say that the Jewish community played a significant role in Ukrainian history, and the prominent Jewish political, cultural, and religious leaders of Ukrainian descent played a great role in the history of the State of Israel. Just to mention a few prominent Ukrainian-born and raised Jewish figures: famous Jewish Zionist leader Zeev Jabotinsky, the second president of Israel, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, famous Israeli defense minister Moshe Dayan, the third and the fifth prime ministers of Israel, Levi Eshkol and Golda Meir, the first Israeli foreign minister, Moshe Sharet. And I can go on and on with the list of Jewish prominent figures of Ukrainian descent. Of course, the Hasidic movement emerged in the territory of Ukraine, and Ukraine was the point of departure for thousands of Jewish pioneers who went to Palestine to build the modern state of Israel. It therefore comes as no surprise that Israel was among the first countries to recognize Ukraine and to establish diplomatic relations and to deepen our bilateral relations to the level where we enjoy special partnership. We arrive at this 30th anniversary of the Ukrainian-Israeli relations with a proactive political dialogue at the highest level. Last year, President Zelensky visited Israel, and this year, Ukraine welcomed Israeli President Isaac Herzog. Rada and Knesset have regular contacts of friendship groups and secretariats. Next year, we expect exchange of visits of speakers of our parliaments. Ukraine is grateful for Israel's support of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, especially in the United Nations. We hope that Israel will eventually join the Crimea platform. I am particularly grateful to Jewish organizations of Ukraine for their support and in our efforts to defend Ukraine from Russia's aggressive expansionism. This year, the Ukraine-Israel Free Trade Agreement entered into force. I must say that Ukraine has a similar bilateral free trade agreement only with Canada, another country where Ukraine has millions of Ukrainians who create this special bond between our countries. The result is evident. In just 9 months of the 2021, our trade increased by 10%. The next logical step is the negotiations on expanding the FTA on services, not only goods. This can really boost trade between our countries for the benefit of our people. The Ukrainian side is ready to hold such negotiations. Lately, we have seen an inflow of Israeli investments in Ukraine. They now reached $100 million. But this is peanuts compared to what we can achieve. Ukraine is open for Israeli investors, and the government of Ukraine is committed to facilitating and protecting their investments. Both Israel and Ukraine are famous for their IT sectors. In a week, we will host the 4th Ukraine-Israel Innovation Summit, which will bring together entrepreneurs, technology businesses, government, and education representatives. Over 15,000 Ukrainian specialists are involved in the Israeli IT sector. This is one of the most promising spheres of our cooperation. Both Israel and Ukraine are also known for their agricultural technologies. Ukraine plays an important role as a supplier of grain to Israel. We now also launch a big irrigation project in the southern regions of Ukraine. We are open for more fruitful cooperation in this area. COVID-19 pandemic had a major negative impact on our people-to-people contacts over the past 2 years, but we now jointly work to restore them in full, in particular to create appropriate conditions for Jewish pilgrims to visit historical and holy places, including the organization of the annual pilgrimage of Braslav Heseds to Uman. We can really be proud of so many achievements, and we have even wider prospects ahead. Centuries-long friendship combined with today's mutually beneficial cooperation in many areas make the future of Ukraine-Israel relations very promising. There are no problems that we cannot discuss, and there are no problems that we cannot solve in relations between our countries. Thank you.
Foreign Minister Kuleba, you've done such an eloquent job of laying out the history and the deep sort of strong fabric that links together Israel and Ukraine and the people, not just the governments. So let me broaden it out a little more. At this moment, given the geopolitical situation in the world, and certainly with the pandemic in the background, obviously, why is it so important? I mean, the significance of Ukraine's relationship with the United States and Europe at this particular moment in history?
Well, I think that Israel, a country that suffered from a number of foreign aggressions, knows very well two things: that to be successful and to be able to defend your right to choose your way of life, you need first to be strong, and second, to have strong friends. And this is the lesson that we learned from our history, but also from the history of the State of Israel. And in this context, partnership with the United States of America is absolutely essential. Since 2014, this is the beginning of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. The United States have become Ukraine's partner number one in security and political affairs. And this year was particularly successful in our bilateral relations. We reset the Commission for Strategic Partnership. We signed the new Charter of Strategic Partnership that meets realities and needs of the day. President of Ukraine visited Washington. There are numerous contacts. So in these difficult times, we have a partner whom we can trust and who is helping us to defend our sovereignty and territorial integrity. Of course, recently Ukraine's Minister of Defense visited Israel, and we also believe that there are good preconditions for deepening our relations with Israel, not only in trade, but also in military, in defense sphere. There is a lot Israel can do. Many years ago, Ukrainians helped the state of Israel to stand on its feet. And we are sure that in the most difficult moment, Israel will also help Ukraine to repel any attempts to put Ukraine on its knees.
Foreign Minister Kuleba, thank you so much for taking part in this third Kiev Jewish Forum and for all those words. Thanks very much for taking part.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Next, we'll bring in an Israeli government official who has a personal connection to this forum. Zev Elkin is Minister of Jerusalem Affairs and Housing and Construction. He was born in Kharkiv, making Aliyah to the Jewish state after university. His story, just one more example, you've already heard many, of the intricate web of personal ties between Israel and Ukraine. Minister Elkin, welcome to the forum.
Буквально в тот момент, когда я записываю для вас это приветствие, мы закончили заседание совместной межправительственной экономической комиссии по сотрудничеству между нашими странами. В этом году, в год 30-летия наших отношений, начал работать договор о зоне свободной торговли между Израилем и Украиной. Состоялся визит президента Израиля в Украину. Мы видим, что все время и уровень экономических связей, уровень культурных связей, уровень дипломатических связей все время развивается, но у нас есть еще огромный потенциал, у нас очень много работы, поэтому это 30-летие, это возможность посмотреть ретроспективно назад, что было сделано за эти 30 лет, и главное подумать вместе, что мы можем сделать еще для того, чтобы использовать полный потенциал развития отношений между нашими странами, в котором, естественно, выходцы из Украины в Израиле и еврейская община Украины – это те два моста, которые связывают наши две страны.
Thanks very much to Israeli Minister Ze'ev Elkin. And the relationship between Ukraine and Israel is not just about governments, as you've heard. It's, of course, about people. Ukraine has been a major source of immigration to Israel over the decades, with an estimated 500,000 people of Ukrainian descent living in the Jewish state today. Weighing in with some more context on that is Israel's Minister of Immigrant Absorption, Pnina Tamano-Shata. Minister Tamano-Shata, thanks very much for being with us. I'll turn it over to you.
שלום וברכה לכל באי הכנס פורום קייב באוקראינה. ברצוני לברך את כל המשתתפים בברכת הצלחה וברכה גם בכנס ובכלל בכל ימות השנה. ברשות בוריס לוז'קין, נשיא הקונפדרציה של יהודי אוקראינה, רוברט סינגר, יושב ראש המרכז לאימפקט יהודי, סשה רויטמן, מנכ"ל התנועה למאבק באנטישמיות. אנחנו בעצם מציינים 30 שנה לכינון היחסים עם אוקראינה. מאז עלו לישראל למעלה מ-200,000 יהודים. כל אחד מהם הוא ברכה לישראל ולחברה הישראלית, מנוע צמיחה לאומי, כלכלי, חברתי. אנחנו גם מציינים השנה 30 שנה לעלייה מברית המועצות לשעבר. העולים החדשים הם הכוח החלוץ מאז קום המדינה וגם בימים האלה לבניית חברה ישראלית חזקה. יש לי את הזכות להיות שרת העלייה והקליטה ולחבר בין קצוות תבל בציונות, בחיבור האנושי, במגוון העשיר והמיוחד של העם היהודי. אני רוצה לברך את כל הארגונים ואת באי הכנס על העבודה הנפלאה שלכם, לחיזוק הקהילה היהודית, אך לא רק, להמשך עידוד העלייה לישראל. הגורל שלנו תלוי זה בזה, וממשלת ישראל נותנת דגש מאוד גדול, גם לעלייה וקליטה, אבל גם לקשר בין התפוצות. על כך אני מודה לכם שאתם שותפים עיקרים. איחולי ברכה והצלחה ממני פנינה תמנו-שטה, כאמור, שרת העלייה והקליטה.
Thanks so much to Israel's Minister Tamano-Shata. And let's keep focused on Jerusalem. Joining us now from there is Israel's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Idan Roll. Deputy Minister, thanks so much for being here today.
Mr. Boris Goshkin, initiator and chairman of the forum, distinguished members of the forum. This year marks 30 years of diplomatic relations between Israel and the Ukraine, and their relationship grows stronger with time. Recently, President Yitzhak Herzog even paid a very significant visit to Ukraine. We have a shared cultural and political history, as some of the main figures of the State of Israel originate in Ukraine. Zev Jabotinsky, President Ben-Zvi, Prime Ministers Moshe Sharet, Levi Eshkol, and Golda Meir. The cooperation between our countries is expressed in a growing number of areas, such as political, economic, cultural, knowledge sharing in the fields of health and technology. A few days ago, a high-level Ukrainian delegation led by the Minister of Defense arrived in Israel to sign agreements and protocols for economic and other cooperation. The visit and the agreements signify the continuation of promoting relations between the two countries. The corona plague has caused suffering and restrictions in both countries. This is another field where we are more than willing to share knowledge and experience with Ukraine and are ready to expand cooperation between government bodies, hospitals, and commercial companies. Unfortunately, a significant part of the common past of both nations is related to the horrors of World War II. We welcome the memorial event in Ukraine to mark the 80th anniversary of the Babinyar tragedy. Some 34,000 Jewish men, women, and children were killed in mass shootings on the outskirts of the capital, Kiev, on the last 2 days of September 1941. It is important to mention that in Ukraine today live thousands of people who helped and saved Jews during World War II. We provide assistance in locating them and award them and their families the title of Righteous Among the Nations. These are real heroes, and they are the heroes that Ukraine should be proud of. At the same time, the struggle must continue against manifestations of the anti-Semitism that sometimes raises its ugly head, as well as the combat against the glorification of Ukrainian heroes who were collaborators with the Nazis. We congratulate Ukraine on the adoption of a law to prevent and combat anti-Semitism based on the working definition of IRA. Thank you to the President of Ukraine for his commitment to the fight against anti-Semitism. Last but not least, it is worth noting the contribution of the Jewish community in Ukraine and the community of Ukrainians in Israel for their contribution to strengthening ties between the two countries.
We're now honored to have with us here Israeli Ambassador to Ukraine, Michael Brodsky. Formerly Israel's envoy to Kazakhstan, Ambassador Brodsky presented his credentials in Kiev back in August and quickly got to work on nurturing the close bonds between Israel and Ukraine. Ambassador Brodsky, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
So, I mean, you really have a front row seat to this relationship that we're talking about over these 2 days, where, its status is now, where it's heading. Share with us a bit of your take on the importance of Israel's ties to Ukraine.
Well, first of all, I'd like to use this opportunity to congratulate the organizers of the Kiev Jewish Forum and, first of all, Mr. Lozhkin, with this wonderful event and an important event, since this year on December 26th, we mark 30th anniversary of the diplomatic relations between Israel and Ukraine. And I believe that over these 30 years, we managed to reach a not only a high level of relationship, but I would describe it as a family type of relationship, a very close, intimate relationship between the leaders of our countries, between the business communities, the politicians, but what is most important, between the two people. And as you know, about 500,000 of former Ukrainian citizens currently live in Israel. And on the other hand, there is a vibrant and active Jewish community in Kiev and other Ukrainian cities. And these two communities, they create a vital and an amazing human bridge, which turns our relations from formal relations based on interests into something much bigger than this, into something which is based on mutual sympathy, on a mutual history, and which is something that indeed is unique. And I really want to praise this wonderful relationship between our countries. I've been in Ukraine only 4 months, but just to illustrate the intensity of our relationship, I would like to mention only a few events which have happened over the last month. I will start with mentioning the pilgrimage to Uman, something that happens every year, but this year it was especially complicated because on the one hand, people were allowed to come to Uman, and more than 30,000 pilgrims from Israel came to Uman to pray on Rabbi Nachman's grave. On the other hand, we had to deal with the limits and with the rules and limitations related to Corona, both on the Ukrainian side and on the Israeli side, which was indeed very complicated. And only thanks to the synergy between the two countries, the police of the two countries, the security forces, we managed to conduct it smoothly without any major incidents. And I'm happy that everything went well this year. Then in the beginning of October, there was the first visit of the Israeli President Yitzhak Herzog to Ukraine, dedicated to the commemoration of the 80th anniversary of Babinyar. But it also was a state visit, and his first visit as a president outside of the country, which is very, very symbolic and very important. Then just recently, we had a visit of the Minister of Defense, the newly appointed Minister of Defense, Mr. Reznikov, to Israel, a very fruitful and very meaningful visit, which happened only last week. Then we had celebrations of the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah across the country, in all major cities across Ukraine. So as you see, our bilateral agenda is packed, is very intense, And I believe that the next year will be also very interesting in terms of the bilateral relations. We are discussing a possibility of Mr. Zelensky's visit Israel, and probably Mr. Bennett, the Israeli Prime Minister, who hasn't visited Ukraine yet, will come and pay an official visit to Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So the next year, I believe, will be very interesting in terms of the bilateral relations. And of course, most of the events will be dedicated to the 30th anniversary of the diplomatic relations between Israel and Ukraine.
Sure, something that we're going to be talking about more in the course of this forum. Ambassador Brodsky, thanks so much for that, and for really an important reminder that the relationship between countries is much more about people than about government. It's really much more important, and that's certainly the case with Ukraine and Israel. And of course, you're welcome to stay online and listen to the guests ahead. We next have the honor of welcoming Ambassador Brodsky's counterpart, Ukraine Ambassador to Israel, Yevgen Kornichuk. Ambassador Kornichuk, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So give us a bit of your take on the ties as they stand now between the countries, between Ukraine and Israel, and maybe where you hope to see it going forward.
Well, I'm glad to say that they never been as strong as they are at the moment. We are enjoying the full cooperation in many fields of mutual interest. So endless amount of questions back and forth, invitations over delegations, official and business people coming on back and forth. So I have to admire the good cooperation in the agricultural field, assuming that the biggest amount of the trade is happening between Israel and Ukraine, Ukraine exporting the agricultural goods, as well as the good cooperation in the medical field. So assuming that assistance and the mutual cooperation on the issues related to the fighting of the COVID-19 infection. So lots of different things going on at the moment. We just had official delegation of Ukraine last week having the session of the Intergovernmental Economical Commission that was headed with the Minister of Defense, Mr. Reznikov. So I assume that we will enjoy much broader security cooperation between two countries as well. I'm honestly proud to be the part of this process, and I'm willing to move ahead as quickly as possible.
You mentioned, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic and the cooperation on health. It's one of the many things and elements of cooperation between Ukraine and Israel that we're talking about in this two-day forum. You as somebody, an ambassador who's really on the front line and an insider to the relationship, looking forward, is there a particular area of cooperation that you think we should be looking at or that you think is really has the most potential for more cooperation going forward? First
of all, I have to admit, I told that a few times already, that the first 20 million of Pfizer vaccine, Ukraine have got with the Israeli assistance, believe it or not, because the previous prime minister called to the head of the New York office, and we arranged the phone call between Mr. Burla and President Zelensky, and got the contract at the beginning of this year.
A very important phone call.
Yes, exactly. So I appreciate this initiative for the Israeli side. And currently we are having together working on the widgets and the new vaccine medical trial in Ukraine of the Israeli origin. So our ministries are working hard together. We exchange the information on a daily basis, and we are very much appreciate Israeli assistance, and we are doing anything what is possible from our side in order to advance this cooperation that should be mutually amicable for both parties.
Sure. In no area more than health, and certainly in fighting this pandemic, that has created cooperation between countries that even, as you say, even two nations with such close ties before that really have to step it up to deal with such a situation. If we're looking forward in terms of economics on that front, that's one of the things we're going to be talking about here. Startups, Israel is a startup nation, and things that can be learned for Ukraine. Are there anything, I know there's already a lot of business cooperation, or is that a field that you think should be focused on in the future or stepped up a little bit?
December 15, next week, we will be holding the first Israeli-Ukrainian Innovation and Investment Summit. I am saying it first because it happened actually 4 times already, but it was focused just in innovation, in high tech.
Right.
This time we will be focusing not just on the high tech, we will be having the different panels, including the health, where the Ukrainian Minister of Health will be participating. An additional panel would be on a construction business. And as you know, Israelis are very heavily investing in the Ukrainian construction. So I will welcome all the participants that are interested to take part in this event. So I think it's a much broader way to cooperate in the issues related to the energy. So
very important issue for the future, certainly.
Israel just showed the great expertise together with Americans extraction on the shelf of the Mediterranean.
Right.
The gas started just a few years ago, and now they are exporting gas to the other nations. So we will be welcoming the Israeli-American presence on the shelf of the Black Sea, Ukrainian national waters, in order to do the similar exercise. So that would help both countries to our prosperity and energetical independence, if you wish.
Sure. Those are all things you mentioned that are so critical to both countries' futures, whether it's health, that everybody has learned that a lot of things need to change going forward to deal with maybe the inevitable next pandemic, and of course, energy security and so forth. So December 15th, that Innovation Forum sounds like something to watch for. Ambassador Kornichuk, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
And now back to Ukraine. We welcome to the forum head of the Diplomatic Academy of Ukraine and Ukraine's former ambassador to Israel, Gennady Nadolenko. Ambassador Nadolenko, thanks so much for joining us today.
Shalom, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me. Dear friends, dear ministers, dear ambassadors, dear Mr. Lozhkin and Robert Zinger, thank you both for this invitation to the 3rd edition of this Kiev Jewish Forum. I'm really happy to speak here, especially on the eve of 30th anniversary of establishment of diplomatic relations between our 2 countries, which we will celebrate very soon on 26th of December this year. Ukraine and Israel have long, numerous links between our 2 countries, religious, economic, historical, basically anything you name. We are 2 states that were born on the ruins of the last world empires. Israel in 1948, the independent Ukraine in 1991, but we both have a 1,000-year-old history, which includes many aspects of our cooperation and understanding between each other. Before World War II, Ukraine was home to millions of Jews, a place where the Jewish culture was thriving, and I'm sure it will be like that years to come. And as my minister said previously, Ukraine is the country of origin for many prominent Jews, artists, religious, political leaders. He named all of them, so I will not repeat all of them. But definitely for Ukrainians, Israel has also been a very important place and remains a place of pilgrimage, a place of power, where lots of Ukrainian citizens found home, fall in love, found peace and prosperity, and so on. Nowadays, all established links have remained, and I'm confident they will only develop in the future. Our countries have many similarities, and they have many similar challenges. Sometimes in Ukraine, Israel has been referred as the transformation role model and the country that managed to achieve prosperity amid permanent armed conflicts. Unfortunately, Russia-Ukrainian conflict has been going on for as long as 8 years already and has taken many lives of Ukrainian citizens. And I would like to thank Israel for providing and continuing support to Ukraine, especially in medical assistance. And it's not only the treatment of wounded Ukrainians in Israel and internship of Ukrainian doctors in Israeli hospitals, but also about assisting in implementing clinical and training programs in Ukrainian military and civilian hospitals and much, much more. For us, it's very, very important. So please continue with that. I was ambassador of Ukraine to State of Israel for more than 10 years, and all this time I tried to bring our bilateral relations to the highest level and strengthen our economic, political, cultural cooperation and many, many other ways of our cooperation. And now when I look back, I see a lot of positive results of work of our team. And today I would like to praise our new ambassadors from both sides for their wonderful job and continuing on this track. Thanks to this cooperation, our contacts now are on the highest level. They look powerful and friendly. Also, the trade and economic cooperation is developing. Notwithstanding pandemic crisis, this year we managed to organize a few very important visits, especially the visit of the President of Israel to Ukraine and the recent meeting of the Trade and Economic Commission in Israel. Thanks to such cooperation, the total trade turnover between Ukraine and Israel has grown gradually. I want to say that 30 years, not a lot for a country, but it's not little either. During this time, we learned a lot about our countries, about our people. We tried to understand each other, we learned from each other and help each other. We are discussing hard questions and hard questions of the past and look with optimism in the future. And I hope we will continue to do so, and I hope this future will be bright for our nations for many, many years ahead. And here I really would like to thank again Kyiv Jewish Forum and its organizers for doing exactly that, bringing our countries closer, bringing our people and nations closer together. Please continue doing so for many, many years until 120. Best wishes to all of you. I wish all of you happy Hanukkah, happy New Year. Thank you very much to all of you. Toda rabba. Дуже дякую.
Thanks so much. It's very nice to hear that you are seeing the fruits of your labor after 10 years of ambassador in that role. Thanks so much, Ambassador Nadolenko, for being part of this conversation.
Thank you.
And finally, let's hear from Misha Galperin, President and CEO of the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History, also a senior advisor to the Combat Anti-Semitism movement. Misha, I know you also have a personal connection to this region. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Presidents Zelensky and Herzog, ministers, ambassadors, world leaders, and honored guests. I'm Dr. Misha Galperin, or in Ukrainian, Mikhailo Davidovich Halperin, or in Ivrit, Moshe Ben David. I was born and raised in the city called the Pearl of the Black Sea, or in Odessan dialect, Odessa Mama. One of the most Jewish cities in the world, and also one of the most international, cosmopolitan with Greeks, Italians, Turks, Germans, Russians and Ukrainians, along with Jews being there from its founding back in the 18th century. Not a melting pot, but a gorgeous mosaic. Everyone reaching some level of integration, but also retaining their own identity. Odessa was once the only place in the Russian Tsarist Empire where Jews were actually not just allowed to live, but were enticed to immigrate to. There were never strangers in Odessa, but among its founders and leading citizens. A noted sociologist once wrote that Jews of Odessa are more like the Jews of San Francisco than they're like Jews of Moscow. They always felt they belonged, at least until the pogroms of 1905. I'm also a grandson of Rabbi Moshe Rabinovich of the shtetl of Tamashpal in the Vinnytsia Oblast, halfway between Odessa and Kiev. He was murdered by the Einsatztruppen along with 400 of his congregants and family on August 4th, 1941, in what has become known as Holocaust by bullets, at the edge of a ravine, much like Babinyar in Kiev. My father, who watched the massacre from a mulberry tree and dreamt about it every night for the next 50 years, was the only survivor. In 1957, he married my mother, a descendant of German Reform Jewish engineers, musicians, and physicians brought to Odessa in the mid-19th century to help build the southern window to Europe. We came to the US as refugees from the Soviet regime in 1976. I'm very proud of the fact that when I was getting my US citizenship in the early 80s, I put Ukraine as my country of origin, way before the Soviet Union fell apart and Ukraine became independent. When I was in Kiev for the historic Board of Governors of the Jewish Agency of Israel meetings, where I served as deputy to Natan Sharansky, another Ukrainian Jew, I went on a tour with a local guide who told us that the very first written mention of Kiev was found in a Jewish document. The so-called Kievan letter, discovered by the famous Cairo Geniza, a cemetery for sacred Jewish documents that became frayed but cannot be destroyed because they contain the name of God. It was discovered by Solomon Schechter, a great Jewish scholar, and it was a letter to the Kievan Jewish community describing the author's efforts to redeem his brother, held at a debtor's jail in Kiev for taxes he owed. Pidyon Shvuim, redeeming of the captives, is the highest religious duty a Jew has because of our reverence for life and in order to reassure that neither the captive nor his family would suffer torture and other hardships. I'm not entirely sure that it is, in fact, the first written mention of the great city, but it is a testament of how far back our people's history in Ukraine goes back. So the establishment of diplomatic relations between the Jewish state and the Ukrainian state 30 years ago is what only should have been all along. Ukraine was home to extraordinary Jewish figures from Baal Shem Tov to Nachman of Bratslav to the Lubavitcher dynasty to Shalom Aleichem, also born Rabinovich, like my grandfather, and my grandfather's cousin according to family history, though a black sheep in a Hasidic family. To Leon Pinsker, whose Zionist ideas preceded Theodor Herzl's. Jabotinsky, Bialik, Sholem Ash, Ilya Ilf, Isaac Babel, and the great pianists and violinists of Odessa school founded and named after Pinchas Stolarsky. I was thrown out of the school for bad behavior when I was 6 years old, in spite of my mother being a graduate and my grandmother teaching there for many years. And my grandmother's students at the Odessa Conservatory, Emil Gils, Bela Davidovich, David Oistrach, Misha Elman, etc. As one American Jewish joke goes, a cultural exchange between the Soviet Union and the US is when they send us their Jewish violinists from Odessa and we send them our Jewish violinists from Odessa. And now, to have the president of Ukraine being Jewish? Is Buzzy Herzog Ukrainian? No? Polish? Well, nobody's perfect. Seriously, was the Babin Yar site finally getting its due with the revival of Jewish religious and cultural life through synagogues, Jewish community centers, museums, restoration of cemeteries, and a robust and growing business relationship between Ukraine and Israel and Ukraine and the US? Might I be able to reclaim my Ukrainian citizenship in addition to my American one? When leaving the USSR in 1975, we had to pay for the privilege of giving up Soviet citizenship because USSR and Israel, who sent us the invitations to immigrate, had no diplomatic relations. Congratulations to all involved on behalf of the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History, where I serve as the CEO, and my colleagues at American and Jewish foundations and NGOs I work with, particularly the co-sponsors of this forum, Combat Anti-Semitism Movement. We're building it as a movement, like the one that led to freedom for Soviet Jewry, the defeat of apartheid in South Africa, the movements that led to the establishment of the Jewish state, as well as the movements that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the color revolutions, and the independence and democratization of Ukraine. May all three allies, Ukraine, Israel, and the United States, continue to build their relationship, and as our sages say, may we go from strength to strength. Or, as I found out when studying at Yeshiva University in New York, in the words of what is a priestly blessing, and I discovered my relationship to the Kohanim by seeing this on the screen. As Mr. Spock of Star Trek used to say, live long and prosper. Thank you.
Dr. Misha Galperin, thanks so much for that. What a personal story you have, and what a beautiful way you've woven it together with your work at the National Museum. Thanks so much for joining the forum.
Thank you for having me.
And with that, we've come to the close of day one of the 2021 Kiev Jewish Forum, hosted by the Jewish Confederation of Ukraine, the Center for Jewish Impact, and the Combat Anti-Semitism Movement.